Let's talk about different player types in poker and how to exploit each of them. So, given that I have previously only played basically on Bovada, which is anonymous, then I can't get a decent sample on any specific player. So I'm just using a PokerStars 200NL database to categorize players based on VPIP and whether they're a recreational or a reg, and seeing basically people's weaknesses and strengths and everything like that. So yeah, one thing that I noticed is that basically there's a huge correlation between VPIP and how people play, both pre-flop and post-flop. Like, obviously, if somebody has a lower VPIP, then they're also just, they're going to 3-bet less pre-flop, they're going to squeeze less pre-flop, they're going to call less pre-flop, versus an open, stuff like that. They're going to RFI less. All of that stuff makes sense. Of course, if somebody has a 22% VPIP, they're going to play tighter than somebody who's playing a looser VPIP, right? And this is just for regs, filtered for regs. So, if there were recreationals added in there, then the VPIP minus the gap between VPIP and pre-flop raise would be higher. But anyway, so basically what you find is that, tighter players just fold more pre-flop all around, which makes a lot of sense. But then when you look at post-flop numbers as well, tighter players are also too tight post-flop too. So even though they play too tight of a range pre-flop, and so they end up being too linear pre-flop and stuff, like they don't raise enough bluffs pre-flop, and they don't call enough of the marginal hands pre-flop, for example, in the big blind versus an open. Even though that's the case, then they still play too tight post-flop as well. So when you look at 1-1 soft flop, 1-1 soft flop is directly correlated to how aggressive or how loose you are pre-flop. So, players, regs who have a VPIP of 26 or more have a 1-1 soft flop of 50.5. Tight players with less than 23% VPIP are all the way down at 47.9. So that's a difference of 2.6. So even though tight players are playing tighter pre-flop, then they're also not winning the pot post-flop as much either. Their win to showdown is higher as well, so basically they're less inclined to bluff. Let's see. A little bit lower c-bet frequency on the turn and the river. A little bit lower on the flop as well, but it's really not a huge difference. But, a little bit lower flop, turn, and river c-bet frequency is important. Call river efficiency is higher. So essentially when they call the river, then they're going to have a stronger hand on average. They're not calling weak bluff catchers as much. Here, the tighter players are really folding a ton versus bets in general. I gotta look up. What are the... hold on a second. So the general fold frequencies that you should have in these situations, like fold the flop bet should be 33 to 34, 33 to 35. So all of these all of the regs are overfolding, but especially tight regs. Like, they're supposed to be folding like 34%, and they're folding 48.7%. So they're massively overfolding flop. And part of that, especially the reason why tight players are especially overfolding versus bets more post-flop is because they end up capping the range pre-flop and post-flop. So basically, for example, and maybe we can pull up a GTO sim to show the 3-bet ranges and such. For example, especially 3-betting from the big blind, you're supposed to 3-bet fairly wide, and for example, big blind versus cutoff open. This is supposed to be your 3-bet range. You're supposed to 3-bet lots of crap. suited connectors and, one gappers, two gappers, king 5 suited, king 6 suited, king 10 off, like all these offsuit hands as well, blah, blah, blah. And guess what? If people don't 3-bet that trash like they're supposed to, I guess it's even more severe 3-betting big blind versus small blind, where you're supposed to 3-bet so many low equity hands. If you're not 3-betting those low equity hands, then once you call, you're gonna have too much trash, and so then therefore you're just gonna overfold. And also, I mean, I can show this in a second, but basically tighter players also raise the flop in the turn too strong as well. So basically, whenever they call, then they're just capping their range. So essentially, their folding frequencies are extremely high on all streets. Like, okay, so I already said flop fold should be 33 to 35. They're all over folding. Turn fold should be 38 to 41. Okay, all regs are over folding. But, especially tight regs, they're folding 51.9%, and it's supposed to be 38 to 41, so it's supposed to be around 40, so they're over folding by 12% or something. And then on the river, fold is supposed to be 47 to 50, so the looser regs end up not really overfolding too much versus a random river bet, but then the medium to tight players are way overfolding versus river bets in general. Now that doesn't mean that they're overfolding versus river triple barrels necessarily, but just all river bets in general. So that includes situations where for example, they check back flop, check back turn, and, totally capping themselves, and then they'll overfold by 20 or 30% or something like that. So yeah, and then also just tight regs are also betting the turn in the river a lot less than medium to loose regs. They're also raising post flop less. So essentially, tight players, they're too tight pre-flop, but they're also way too tight post-flop. So I think the fact that they're tight pre-flop is is making them play more tight post-flop, and the fact that they're playing tight post-flop is also making them play tighter pre-flop. So if you're a weaker player, and you're not bluffing as much, and you're just not able to win the pot post-flop as much, then naturally you're going to end up playing tighter pre-flop to kind of cover up your imbalance, I guess, to lose less basically, or to just, basically just to be a rake back grinder or something at best. And then the other way, if you're playing tight pre-flop, you're not raising enough bluffs pre-flop, then when you just call pre-flop, then you're just going to be too wide. And so you're just going to overfold post-flop, and you're not going to find enough bluffs, etc. So they kind of affect each other. And so basically, like, what I didn't realize before is that tight players, tight meaning just low VPIP, low 3-bet, low pre-flop raise. Well, not necessarily low pre-flop raise, but just amongst regs, low VPIP, low 3-bet, stuff like that, low RFI, especially low 3-bet, like blind v blind and stuff. Then they're also just going to play really tight post-flop, so you can run them over pre-flop and run them over post-flop. Actually, let's show this. Wait, no, that's not right. Let's actually just look at the reg alias, the tight reg alias here. So yeah, they're facing an open here. If a tight reg is facing an open, like, look at their folding frequencies. Blue means they're too tight, so they fold too much. And what you see is that, they're not 3-betting enough pre from the big blind, and they are folding too much as well. And so essentially, whenever there's a tight player behind you, when you have the opportunity to RFI, then you just want to RFI really wide. Not only because they're going to overfold pre-flop, they're not going to bluff 3-bet you enough pre-flop, but they're also going to play too tight post-flop. So you can just totally run them over, basically. Actually, we can look at a couple of their 3-bet ranges just to show kind of what's going on. Here, they are 3-betting some bluffs and stuff, but for the most part, they're just 3-betting 8s plus, ace king, ace queen, king queen suited, ace jack suited, king jack suited, and a few bluffs. Whereas, small blind versus, or big blind versus small blind open, they're supposed to be 3-betting a lot more bluffs than they actually are. Big blind versus button, this is their 3-bet range. It's pretty darn strong. Very few offsuit hands, not many disconnected hands. Whereas, in theory, they're supposed to be 3-betting, lots of bluffs. And I think it would be even more extreme, say, if big blind versus low jack or something. Yeah, big blind versus low jack, they just don't. Well, I guess they 3-bet it occasionally with a bluff and stuff, but basically just 3-betting like jacks plus ace king, something like that. So essentially the point is, if they're going to play 2-type pre-flop and post-flop, you can just RFI much wider against them. So here I've created a RFI ranges that kind of basically, for RFI, you can RFI tight, GTO, or loose. And so if you're against a tight player, if there are any tight players behind you, when you want to RFI, then you just want to RFI very loose. So, in theory, we're supposed to be opening 18.7% in the low jack. Now we can, in practice, then we can expand to 26.7%, something like that. Like, this is kind of an arbitrary range. I didn't actually run a sim on this, but basically I just said against tight players, just open any hands that are losing 3 big blinds per 100 or better. So if it's losing 3 big blinds per 100 in theory, but they're way overfolding, they're not raising enough, and they're going to overfold post-flop, you're definitely going to make that up, and these hands are going to become profitable in practice, or at least, zero EV. So here, for example, like, what are the worst hands that can open? Okay, maybe this is a little bit too loose, but yeah, okay, never mind on that. Because this range is kind of messed up because this is 3-better folds, so then it's prioritizing high cards. But anyway, something like king 4 suited, queen 7 suited, all these suited connectors, pocket pairs, offsuit broadways, ace 9 off, all these hands can just open if there are tight players behind, especially if they're in the big blind. Because, basically the big blind is going to do the bulk of the bluff catching in general. I don't really have a sim to show this, but maybe pull up GTO Wizard just to show kind of what's going on. So basically, the big blind has put in a one big blind pre involuntarily, and so they're going to end up having to be the one who bluff catches post-flop, pre-flop. Pre-flop. So here, GTO Wizard. Oh, there are no calls here. Hold on, I gotta find one of these sims, one of these darn sims with calling. What? Open jam. Okay, so as you see here, say versus a low jack, 2x open. Hijack's only continuing 10%, cutoffs continuing 12, buttons continuing 15, small blind is continuing 13.4, and big blind is continuing 41%, or 40.7. So essentially, if there's a tight player behind, you want to expand your RFI range, but especially if they're in the big blind. Also if they're on the button or the small blind, same thing, but not quite as severe. But still, basically, you can just expand your RFI range here. RFI 8% more here in the low jack, RFI 7.8% more in the hijack, RFI 9.5% more in the cutoff. Opening 10-6 suited, queen 3 suited, and ace 4 off and stuff. On the button, 12.1%, and then in the small blind, 7.8%. And then here, this is just an extra tidbit where if you want to go really loose, like if you want to open really loose against somebody who is going to overfold and under 3-bet, then you can open even wider, 4.6% wider. So the main thing is you want to, I guess I'll write some notes, RFI wider versus tight players pre-flop. So player types, RFI much wider with tight players behind. That's a big thing, and essentially I've been doing that in game on global for I don't know how many hands, like 10,000 hands, 15,000 hands, something like that. And they simply like the tight players, you know, they're tight for a reason, pre-flop and post-flop, and they're just not going to be able to adjust. You know, you would assume that they would adjust at some point, but they really don't seem to so far. And like some of these players, you know, if I've played 10 or 15,000 hands opening wide and stuff, like some of these players, I think I've played like probably 2, 3, 4,000 hands. Like it's a lot of the same players, and yet they don't adjust. They don't even consider adjusting. They just keep on snap folding. So essentially, you just want to open wide against tight regs, and then we can also look at tight recreationals. I put a different VPIP value for regs versus recreationals for what is considered tight. Of course, a recreational is going to be looser on average, so with regs, I just put less than 24% VPIP, and then with recreationals, less than 30% VPIP. And here, when it's less than 30% VPIP, then, yeah, I mean, basically the tight recreationals, they're still going to call a lot, but they're way significantly under 3-betting. And so it's basically a similar thing. You basically just want to open wider against them. Like here, look at this. You know, really strong 3-bet range here, big blind versus button, big blind versus small blind, 3-betting, you know, pretty much just mostly value. Let's see, big blind versus low jack. Like literally just pocket pairs, ace king, ace queen. I mean, it's a low sample, but still. Yada, yada, yada. Yeah, so basically you just want to RFI much wider with tighter players behind. That's a big thing. And then c-bet more aggro, and bet more aggro versus then post flop. Yeah, we can look at that as well. That's a kind of an interesting phenomenon. Let's look at the regs first. Yeah, I mean, we can look at any of these. What am I looking for? Okay, let's look at like when they're the out of position pre-flop caller here. 2-bet pot, out of position pre-flop caller. So, you know, we RFI'd and they called pre. They're just overfolding versus all sizes, which is pretty extraordinary. Yeah, and then once they check call here and they're facing a barrel, they're going to overfold versus barrels as well. Let's see, if we check back flop and now we bet turn, they're going to overfold versus delay bets. They're also under raising. Yada, yada, yada. Let's see, they check call flop, check call turn. Now they're facing a triple barrel. And they're going to overfold versus river barrel. Oh, I didn't realize that it was this high of a fold frequency. So essentially, you know, they're going to call to cap pre, and so that means you can. Wait, hold on a second. I had to take my sweatshirt off. It's getting kind of warm, but off topic. But so they're going to call to cap pre because they 3-bet too strong pre, right? So then they're going to overfold flop naturally, and then when they call flop, well, they would have raised. They raised too strong, so when they call, they're also calling capped on the flop, and so then they overfold versus the turn, and then they call to capped on the turn, and so they're going to overfold on the river. It's kind of a funny thing, but it's basically true. And like we can look at other situations. Well, where is it? Okay, in position pre-flop caller on the flop, in the 2-bet pot, they overfold versus all sizes as well. So again, they're calling two capped pre, and so they're going to overfold post flop. How about turn? You know, once flop goes check check, and now they face a turn delay or a turn probe, whatever you want to call it, they're way overfolding. If they call flop and now they face a turn barrel, they're overfolding versus the. I mean, I don't know what I just said, but basically, if they call the flop, then they're going to overfold versus a turn barrel when out of position or when in position as well. Let's see. Do they overfold versus a triple barrel? It looks like versus 30 and 70% pot, they overfold by a huge chunk, and then they underfold versus 150%. So maybe they're not overfolding as much in this situation, but in general, they're just going to way overfold. Like, and then if you look at on the river, even when they're the pre-flop raiser, or regardless, then they're, you know, all of these blue colors is all, they're just playing too tight, so they're just overfolding versus all of these lines. So, you know, and here too, they're overfolding versus almost every size and every line almost. The tight players are, so that's pretty interesting. Let's continue. What about in position pre-flop caller? Yeah, they're overfolding versus all sizes again. They're starting to raise too much, but even then, I'm pretty sure they just raised too strong, so it kind of doesn't matter. Against the small size, they're overfolding and under raising, which is interesting. So yeah, and also they're even bet folding too much after small betting the flop. So, you know, yeah, as the through a pot out of position pre-flop raiser, you check flop, they stab small, and then you check raise. Then they're overfolding after they, like, if they small bet flop. So that's pretty interesting. You know, if flop goes check check and then you bet turn is out of position, they overfold versus all sizes. And then if they call flop and you double barrel, then they tend to overfold versus the turn barrel as well. Actually, no, they overfold versus all of these sizes, at least after the small c bet. But it looks like they do fold a reasonable amount after 50 or 70% pot as well. Let's see. Flop. If they're the 3-bet pot out of position pre-flop raiser and they check the flop, they're overfolding versus all sizes. If they 30% pot and they face an in-position raise, they're overfolding versus all sizes. It looks like even versus 50% pot. Well, okay, they're not really overfolding there, but yeah. If they see bet the flop and now they check turn, now they overfold versus turn stabs. Let's see. If flop goes check check and you stab is in position, they're going to overfold. So essentially, in almost every node post flop, tight players overfold. It's actually incredible. It's literally one of the most incredible things that I've ever seen in my life. One of the most beautiful things I've seen in my life. Tight players play so incredibly tight pre-flop and post-flop that it doesn't make any sense. How do you 3-bet too strong pre, like for example as the small blind, and still overfold versus imposition stabs? How is that even possible? I don't know, but it's great. So essentially you just, by just bluffing your nuts off, pre-flop and post-flop against tight players, then you basically turn them into recreational players. They just play so tight and so ABC that you literally just bet. You just bet every time pretty much with non-showdown value, and even turning really weak showdown value into bluffs, and they just fold. And if they raise, guess what? They have the nuts and you can just fold. I mean, not exactly, but basically. Let's see, they way overfold here versus flop c-bets as out of position pre-flop caller. When it's like cutoff versus button or low jack versus button, something like that, it seems that they're not necessarily overfolding. They're actually underfolding a little, but they're way under raising and raising too strong. So again, they're just playing way too obvious, so you can just bluff everything. Here, when they're the out of position pre-flop caller, check flop, and then you stab turn is in position, they're going to overfold versus all sizes and under raise. If they check call flop, then they're going to overfold versus turn barrels. So essentially, Oh yeah, and then 4-bet pots, when they're the imposition pre-flop caller, they tend to overfold as well. And as the out of position pre-flop caller, they actually underfold, but then they also underraise. So maybe that's one of the only situations where they're decently underfolding. But basically the big thing is, oh yeah, we can look at tight recreationals as well. But basically the main thing is that tight players really, really want to fold post-flop. Or they really just want to fold. That's what they're playing poker for. They're not playing to win. They're not playing for the glory. They're not playing for, to outplay people or anything. They're playing to fold. They want to minimize their losses. And so you just let them fold. You just bluff everything. So yeah, we can just take a quick look at I mean, I don't want to go through all of these lines for the tight recreationals. We can just look at let's look at just the fold frequencies versus general bets. So, for tight regs as comparison, 49, 52, 58% folding. For tight recreationals, their fold is like 40, 48, 55. So they fold significantly less than tight regs, but tight recreationals also are going to have a wider range and even more capped range than a tight reg. So basically, then over bluffing is still going to be really good. Like, I guess just as one example here, when they're the 2-bet pot out of position pre-flop caller, they 3-bet way too strong pre, and they call too wide, they call way too weak of a range. So then they're just going to way overfold versus flop c-bet versus turn delays versus turn barrels, etc. So, basically the big thing is you just tight players what am I doing? Tight players love folding, so way over bluff versus them basically always. Example, RFI wider with them behind. Another example, basically take all indifferent non-showdown value and bet as a bluff post-flop in most situations. Well, maybe that's not totally true. But how do I explain this? Actually that is true. So basically all indifferent non-showdown value. So if a hand bluffs at some frequency in theory, you want to bluff it against tight players. You don't want to check. You just want to bluff and let them overfold. Like, I don't know, I'll pull up a random board. It doesn't really matter, but basically the way to outplay them is not difficult at all. So yeah, it'll take a minute to load. Basically, you just way over bluff, and they just keep on folding. And some players, it almost seems like they get frustrated that you keep betting against them and stuff, but they just keep folding. And guess what? If they're just gonna keep folding, then they're actually never gonna see, they're not gonna see a showdown as frequently as theory, and so they're not actually even seeing that you're bluffing. They just assume that you just keep having value, Okay, this flop is basically a range bet, so it doesn't really matter, but say we're barreling turn, for example. Okay, here. Okay, we can start barreling ace-jack on this board. Okay, interesting. Ace-jack and ace-10 are basically, well, I guess they probably have enough showdown value to just check back, but, ace-6, ace-5, ace-4. Jack 10, Jack 9, 10, 9. All these hands are already mixes in theory, so you definitely just want to barrel them. Even these total air hands, barrel often. Some of these are lower EV to barrel than to check, or at least they're pretty close. But if they're going to overfold, like, I don't know, like let's look at this actual situation and we can see how much they're overfolding by. You know, here, if we're going to barrel pot, they're overfolding by 7%. If they barrel, if we barrel 150% pot, they're overfolding 3%, whatever, or 70%, they're overfolding 5%. So if they're folding, 4 or 5%, something like that, then all of the non-showdown value is just going to become a bluff. So, but you don't want to get too carried away, I guess, because like, for example, say you're actually out of position and you're going to probe turn, I wouldn't really advise you to just bluff all of this non-showdown value necessarily. I would probably just check a lot of these non-showdown value hands to bluff river, but I guess I'll amend this. But basically just yeah, I guess I don't really need that example. It's not really even a good example, but basically just the big thing is that against tight players, they're going to overbluff. I mean, sorry, they're going to overfold, so you want to way overbluff. It seems like it would be more complicated than that, but it's really not. So yeah, actually we can go to this and look at some other things associated with tight regs, or just players in general. Let's see, when people bet, or like what percentage of their flop betting range is air here? A tight reg, 43%, middling reg, 47%, loose reg, 49%. So a tight reg is betting, is also betting too tight, not bluffing enough on the flop. They're bluffing less on the turn, they're bluffing less on the river. So you, wait, let's do this. Tight players. Okay, they love folding, and they, they really dislike bluffing as well. So, yeah, and then if you look at when they raise, wait, this is supposed to be flop, turn, and river as well. When they raise the flop, look at this, like they have way less air when they're raising the flop than a middling to loose reg. They have way less air when they're raising the turn, and way less air when they're raising the river. So essentially, you want to way over bluff versus them, but also they way under bluff. So then you want to overfold versus their aggression. So it really is as simple as that. It seems pretty absurd because how are they playing tight pre-flop but then also playing so tight post-flop? And I don't really know. I think it's basically like a personality trait, I guess. Some people are type A people or type B people. The tighter players they just simply are people who like folding. They don't like putting in lots of money. They are, like humans in general are risk averse, but tight players are extraordinarily risk averse. So if they have top pair and they faced a double barrel and now they're facing a river jam, they're folding. I mean, not always, but in general. And so like, it kind of goes back to, if you could see someone's cards, then how would you play against them? And if you know exactly how they're going to play, then you can maximally exploit them, And so if you're against an average player and you double barrel and now you're considering triple barreling, and you can act and you say you know that they have top pair, a good top pair, for example, then the chances of them folding are not very high, say in a single raise pot. But if it's a tight player, then they probably will fold. So you actually just want to bluff, even if they have, you know, a pretty darn strong hand. They're looking for reasons to fold, so you just have to give those reasons. You know, bet flop, over bet turn, over bet jam river, and they'll fold. And it doesn't make sense. And yeah, and like, you know, I'm pretty sure like at some point players see what you're doing, and maybe they'll just call you down out of frustration or something like that. And it may just be with a random hand. They may just have middle pair and decided to take a stand. But, you know, they're still way over folding, so it doesn't really matter. So, yeah, that's tight players. Tight players are basically really easy to play against. You just run them over, and when they take aggressive action, then you fold. So, essentially, I guess it's like it starts as they take not enough aggressive action with bluffs, and so then they assume that other people do the same. And so, you know, if you have, like, say if you're a tight player and say you bet flop, for example, they call out of position calls, and now you're and now you're in position considering turn barreling. You know, if you have an ace, you're probably just going to check back if you're a weak player. If you have, you know, these jack 5, jack 4, 10 5, 10 4, 5 4. Well, maybe 5-4 they could barrel because it's a straight draw, but like 7-6, 7-5, 7-4, all these non-showdown value hands that have no draw, you're just going to check back. So what is a tight regular, or just a tight player in general? Well, I guess tight recreationals are a little bit more able to bluff, but what is a tight reg going to do? Yeah, they're going to barrel something like good top pair plus. I guess it depends on the player, but maybe top pair top kicker, maybe top pair second or third kicker plus, whatever. And then they're going to barrel their draws, and then they're going to check back all their non-showdown value. And so, and they're not even going to barrel all their draws. Some of their draws they'll check back anyway. So essentially it's just, they're just going to end up way under bluffing. And if they're under bluffing and they're seeing, you know, they're not looking at a solver. They don't know that. They're not thinking like, oh, do I need to bluff some low hands as a bluff, like to have low equity bluffs to bluff on runouts where a lot of my draws complete and stuff, or hit a pair or something. No, they're not thinking that. They're just thinking, if they have a non-draw hand, no draw, no showdown value, they're just checking. And so they assume other people are doing the same. So essentially the big thing is that tight players are simply just playing way too obvious. So that's tight players. That's a good start. What about loose players? Loose players, they are a lot more likely to 3-bet reasonably pre-flop, squeeze reasonably pre-flop, call wider pre-flop. All the obvious pre-flop stuff where, because they have a higher VPIP pre, they're also going to take more aggressive action pre-flop. But then also post-flop, their 1-1 soft flop is higher. Let's see. They c-bet a bit more post-flop. They have a little bit lower call river efficiency, meaning they're calling down a bit wider. They're calling down with weak bluff catchers more. They're not overfolding nearly as significantly versus bets. They're betting a bit more on turn and river, for example, and even on a little bit more on flop. They're raising more post-flop, etc. So, just as a tight player is going to play too tight post-flop, a loose player is also more likely to play loose post-flop. Now, it doesn't mean that they're playing too loose. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily over-bluffing, but they're more likely to find appropriate aggression. So, for example, what is the appropriate river bluffing frequency? So river bluffing frequency should be 33 to 34% here. And loose regs are finding 35%. So they're actually over bluffing slightly. And this is a PokerStars database, which doesn't, you don't have all the hole cards. You only have the hole cards that of hands that went to showdown. So potentially they actually may be over bluffing the river. It's kind of hard to tell, but I would expect that they probably are. And these middling regs are probably bluffing appropriately. So people in general, at least on the average betting, or like the average situation where they're betting the river, they are finding enough bluffs. It doesn't, not necessarily triple barreling or whatever, but yeah. So, looser regs, they have wider range. They have more bluffs available. Like, they have more low equity hands available to be able to bluff with. So naturally, then they're going to bluff more. But then conversely, because they're playing a wider range, then it's going to be a stronger reg on average, so then they're not going to overfold river as much. Or flop or turn or whatever. So, yeah, it's a pretty interesting thing. It's basically the opposite of the tight reg, where, like, even though they're looser pre-flop, they're not really overfolding versus flop bets. They're not overfolding versus flop raises. They are overfolding versus river raises, which is interesting. But, they're not overfolding versus river pets. They're much less likely to way overfold any of these streets. And why is that? It's basically because they're taking more of their bluffs and just betting them or raising them. And so their calling range isn't going to be as capped. Oh yeah, we can actually see this here. Oh. Wait, these are the post-flop folding frequencies. Okay. Well, I could have gone through that. That would have saved some time, I guess, but whatever. Basically just, if you look at the overfolding frequencies post-flop in all these common situations, tighter regs are overfolding 8.2%. Wait, let's hold on a second. Redo this conditional formatting. Just look at overall. It doesn't really matter about individual nodes necessarily. Tighter regs overfolding 8.2% on all of these situations averaged. I mean, I didn't do all the situations, but just the main ones. Middling regs overfolding 6%. Loose regs overfolding 3.1%. So, I mean, yeah. So loose regs are basically just not overfolding as much. They're also more likely to find appropriate raising frequencies. Recreationals are fairly similar, where the tighter recreationals are way overfolding versus bets in general, whereas looser recreationals are not nearly as likely to overfold as significantly. Although, regardless of the recreational, they are under raising. So, bluffing still makes sense. Bluffing too aggressively still makes sense against loose recreationals. It's just not quite as incentivized as against tight players. So yeah, that's kind of the main thing. And I guess we can look at loose recreation or loose regs to see how they play, kind of. I mean, we can just look at the main situation, like when they're the single raise pot out of position pre-flop caller. As you can see here, I mean, they're overfolding a little bit, like 2 to 3%. Not very much though. So basically, you're not necessarily super incentivized to bluff aggressively versus looser regs, which makes sense. And so you end up just defaulting toward theory. I mean, you can default to playing a little bit more aggressive than theory, but you don't want to go too aggressive, because they actually are, they're finding appropriate bluff raises. Well, and value raises too, of course. But, anybody can find a reasonable amount of value raises. But, they're finding enough raises, and they're only overfolding a bit, right? So, yeah. Here versus delay. Versus delays, once they do check turn, then they're overfolding, sure. Versus turn barrels, it looks like they also are overfolding. So it kind of depends on the node, it looks like. Some nodes, they're way overfolding. Some nodes, they're only slightly overfolding. I mean, still looser regs tend to overfold at mini nodes, but it's not going to be nearly as significant as tighter regs. So here versus a triple barrel, they're also overfolding a little bit, but it's not very much. So yeah, other nodes. I mean, I guess we could look at versus flop bet. Okay, they do overfold here. I mean, they are overfolding a reasonable amount, but just not nearly as much as tight regs. Let's see, when they bet and face a raise, as the single raise pot in position pre-flop raiser, they're not nearly as likely to overfold versus the flop raise. So again, basically, the big thing as far as player types is just how loose or how tight a player is pre-flop, and that's just going to totally affect how they play post-flop as well. So, a loose reg is just not nearly as likely to play super obvious and to, just check back all of their non-draw, non-showdown value hands. They're going to bluff a decent amount of them. So yeah, we can even look at bluffing frequencies. For example, when they're the single raise pot in position pre-flop raiser. And let's look at like when they triple barrel. They have 29% bluffs. Theory is 30% bluffs, although I would expect that their actual frequency would be higher than 29%, probably like 31 to 32%. So they actually might be over bluffing a little bit for triple barrel. Whereas tight regs here, let's see, if they triple barrel, 20% weak. So they have way less bluffs, as I've kind of already explained. So the big thing is just how tight or how loose players are. The tighter they are pre-flop, the more aggressive you can go pre-flop and post-flop and just run them over. If they're loose, if they're a loose reg, then you just have to play pretty much theoretically well against them for the most part. There are still going to be obvious situations where they're going to overbluff or underbluff and stuff, but it's not going to be as consistent across the board. Maybe they're going to, say it's a queen high board, they see bet the flop, and then it's a king turn. Well, it's a good turn for them, and they're going to be barreling tons of their bluffs because it's basically a scare card. So in that situation, they're probably going to overbluff. But then on another turn, they might underbluff. Like if the flush completes, maybe they underbluff. I don't know. I haven't really looked at that specifically, but basically, whereas tight players are just going to be the same at basically almost every node, they're going to underbluff and overfold. Loose regs are going to be at least a little bit closer to balanced in general. They're still going to have plenty of nodes where they way overfold, and they're still going to tend toward overfolding as a default. And yeah, but they do find more bluffs, in the flop, turn, and river, and they're less likely to way overfold, or at least they don't overfold as much. So yeah, against loose regs, default to less likely to overfold significantly and more likely to find appropriate aggression through bluffing, or appropriate aggression potentially even overbluffing. So play theoretically well as a default. And of course, you just want to adjust against specific players. Like there are certain players who they're loose pre-flop, but then they're not necessarily going to be way over bluffing post-flop. Whereas some players, it seems like they're just way over bluffing. It's like, dude, you can't just bluff all of your indifferent hands. I mean, you can if you're playing against tighter players, and I guess that's what, they're just assuming you're overfolding. But against a player who's not overfolding, then they're just totally punting. So I guess it is important to, to be confident that, to be confident in who you're playing against, basically. Because it could be a huge punt if you're just bluffing way too aggressively, right? So yeah. So basically, you just want to play theoretically well as a default, and then adjusting based on the specific situation and specific player. Oh yeah, and also, yeah, okay. Yeah, so against loose rags, yeah, basically just playing pretty theoretically well generally, and then just adjusting based on the player and the situation, as is pretty much obvious, but yeah. And then, let's see, I clicked on the wrong button. And then let's look at loose recreationals. Let's see, on the flop here, when there's a single raise pot out of position pre-flop caller, you know, they're going to overfold a little bit and they're going to under raise, so you do want to take more aggressive action against them, but they're not going to overfold as much. So yeah, let's see, versus turn. In turn delay, they definitely under raise, they overfold a bit in general. You know, versus turn barrels, they're not really overfolding that much. So basically, and then like versus river barrels, okay, they're overfolding versus river barrels, but you know, and they're overfolding probably most nodes anyway, similarly. But basically, let's just say loose players less likely to overfold. Yeah, I guess this is good. And more likely to find appropriate aggression, at least enough bluffs. Play theoretically well versus loose regs, and bluff catch super aggressively versus loose recreationals. Basically, rarely folding a bluff catcher. So I can show that. Let's see. So say they bet the river here, triple barrel. Yeah, this is loose recreationals. You know, they're bluffing 30%. Theory is 30%, but then with the, what is it called? The effects of card distribution, when it's, you know, when the cards are mostly hidden, then once you get to showdown, then you're going to actually, like, this is going to show them as having less bluffs than they actually do, so they're going to overbluff as a triple barrel, for example. And, like, it depends on the bet size, I guess, because, like, it looks like they probably overbluff for, you know, 3/4 pot, like, probably like pot or smaller, something like that. You know, maybe they don't bluff as much for overbet, I'm not sure. But, you know, the big thing is, like, they're just going to find a lot more aggression in general. Let's actually look through all the nodes. Actually, turn and river is kind of messed up in this, but, you know, bet, check, bet, they have 38% bluffs. They're supposed to have 32.7% bluffs, so they have way too many bluffs there. Let's see, check, bet, bet. They're supposed to have 31% bluffs. They have 42% bluffs, way over bluffing there. Check, check, bet. They're supposed to have 32.6% bluffs. They have 54% bluffs. I'm not sure how many bluffs you're supposed to have in the after calling a turn probe and betting. But basically, the loose recreationals, they just have too wide of a range and they end up way over bluffing. So, actually, let's rewrite this, or kind of just versus loose regs, blah, blah, blah. And then versus loose recreationals, just bluff catch super aggressively. So basically they're just going to way over bluff. Whoops. Okay. You know, if we look at overall bluffing frequencies, where are we looking at? So overall, they should be bluffing 33 to 34% of the time on the river, or like their their bluffing frequency on the river should be 33 to 34%, and it's 40% for a loose recreational. So essentially, you rarely want to fold the bluff catcher versus recreationals. So essentially, the big idea is that against tight players, you just overfold and underbluff. I mean, they overfold and underbluff, so you want to overbluff and overfold versus them. And then against loose players, they have a looser range pre. They're more ready to battle, basically. They want the glory. They want to outplay you. They want to make that hero call or that hero fold or that hero bluff, whatever. And it almost like goes back to like, it's almost like about what players are most afraid of. Like tight players are afraid of bluffing and getting called and looking foolish, or calling the bluff catcher and looking foolish. You know, you call top pair on the river and they just have two pair and then you look foolish. Whereas loose players, they're more afraid of like checking down total air and then your opponent has like middle pair or something that you could have gotten them to fold or something. So it kind of is just about, I guess it's just different like personality types and how they see the world, essentially. You know, they're like, the loose players are a lot more likely to be way over aggressive and kind of just try to run you over or something. I mean, not all loose players, but in general. And then tight players they'll just let you run them over. So yeah, I mean, that's the big thing with player types. It's actually quite simple, but like the information is fairly simple, like especially about tight players. It's like they're so consistent across almost every single node. Like, I didn't look at all the nodes, but basically like all the folding nodes that I have here in this database, like there are like probably like 100 nodes, and they're probably overfolding in like 96 out of 100 or something like that, something atrocious. And so, you know, it's fairly obvious you just want to bluff super aggressively. Now, it's not necessarily obvious how aggressively you want to bluff. That's basically where you kind of have to analyze the specific situation. Like say you RFI the button and then a tight player calls in the big blind. Then you know you're going to overbluff against them in general. And then it's just your job to analyze, you know, the specific board and, you know, the specific hands in their range and how they will play them, and basically just to figure out how aggressively you want to overbluff. Because you know you're going to overbluff against a player who way overfolds, right? And doesn't bluff raise enough. And then it's just a question of like, do you want to bluff all of your non-showdown value, or do you want to take some of your non-showdown value and check it and bluff the turn or something? But regardless, you just want to way over bluff. So if you have that main idea in your head, then it just becomes much easier to play. You can just totally demolish people with aggression when they're just going to fold. They just love folding. I don't know how you can enjoy folding, but it almost seems like they enjoy folding. Like, I guess I kind of get it where, you know, if you hero fold because you think somebody is really strong, then it can be pretty enjoyable to like, yeah, you know, like yesterday I folded trips with a straight blocker on it was like I forget what the board was, but basically I had trips and they bet and then overbet jammed, and they were a tight player, and I was pretty sure it was a good fold, given that they're tight and they're just going to underbluff and everything. And like, I guess there is a sense of satisfaction to folding there, but I don't see what the satisfaction is in just like overfolding to flop C bets. Like, you just call pre with like, I don't know, ace-8 off, and then you face a small C bet and you're just like, weak hand, fold. Like, maybe they're just waiting to hit a nutted hand and that's all they're thinking about. Like, I think it's kind of like a static, do I have a good hand or do I have a bad hand? And, you know, if you face a pot bet and you have middle pair, then you're just like, oh, I guess I fold. Like, I think, honestly, I think that's how tight players think. They're just like, whoa, that's a big bet. And they just fold without even thinking about it or something. Whereas a loose player, then, like loose regs, for example, they're more likely to be studied, and they're more likely to just want to outplay you by calling you down and stuff. So they're just not going to overfold as significantly. It's supposed to be play theoretically well. So yeah, I would say that's kind of the main thing. Yeah, so, just basically overbluff and overfold versus tight players. Versus loose regs, you just want to play basically theoretically well and analyze their specific, like each specific loose regs deficiencies, where certain loose regs are going to way over bluff, or maybe certain loose regs actually do decently overfold or something across the board. I don't know. It depends on the player. So yeah, or certain loose regs they'll bluff flop and bluff turn aggressively with bluffs, and then they just give up river because they're afraid to triple barrel. Like, it doesn't really go along with the loose aggressive archetype, but there are going to be certain players who do that. So yeah, but basically it just depends on the loose reg. So yeah, and then loose recreationals, then they're just going to way over bluff. Like, they're a recreational, so then they're just going to mindlessly bet random hands, and a lot of those hands are just going to simply be bluffs. And they just have too loose of a range because they call a wide range. Like, I filtered for higher than 30% VPIP. So, we can also look at... Wait, do I have that? Dang, I think I deleted that. I took screenshots of like the 3-bet range pre in certain situation, like certain like button versus cutoff and stuff, and compared them based on tight regs, tight recreationals, loose regs, loose recreationals, and it was pretty striking to where like pretty striking how big the pre-flop differences were as well. But I guess I deleted it. But if you look at a loose recreational calling here, I don't know, big blind versus button. This is their calling range. So, they're calling some of the big pocket pairs, but basically they're calling a mix of all different stuff. 9-3 suited, 8-2 suited, all this kind of stuff. Pretty interesting. Even like, let's say big blind versus low jack, they sometimes call 10-6 off just because they feel like it. And actually I will screenshot that. And then we can compare that to tight recreationals, just as an example. Let's see. Big blind versus low jack. Here's the... Oh, hold on a second. I'm trying to show both ranges on screen. Maybe it's not going to be possible. Oh yeah, here it is. So this is on the left is the loose recreational player. And on the right is the tight recreational player. So the tight recreational player, yeah, they call some like Jack-2 suited, 9-2 suited, etc. But they're not calling nearly as many of these offsuit crap hands, whereas the loose recreationals are. And so, that's just one expression of how loose recreationals easily can overbluff. If they call 10-6 off pre, they flop a straight draw, then they're going to bluff. Or they, or they could just have total air and they're just like, oh, you checked, you must be weak, and they just bluff. Or they don't even have to have a thought process. It's not really that. It's not like recreationals necessarily have a thought process, although they could. But if you're calling so wide, then you're definitely going to overbluff. So essentially, where your EV comes from depends on the player type. Where your EV comes from depends on the player type. naked aggression versus tight players, variable EV versus loose regs, meaning, you know, depends on the situation. And then, let's see, actually, and then what about loose recreationals? Do they overfold? Versus bets? I think we already looked at that, but yeah, I mean, like, you still want to take aggressive action. So, like, this rating isn't actually that helpful. Let's just say over bluff, overfold versus tight players. Depends versus loose regs, although tending on the side of bluffing, bluff catching more aggressively than theory, and, you know, over bluff and underfold versus loose recreationals. And, you know, a big part of your EV, a big part of your EV comes through identifying who you're playing against. So, you know, okay, it's gonna be messed up, I guess. So, you know, the big thing is that it really just depends on who you're playing against. Like, what I've noticed the last few sessions is that some days you're just playing against either, like, you're playing against tight regs and recreationals. And when you do that, like tight regs and just generic recreationals and stuff, and when you do that, you can just go super aggressive and just run them over and just red blind them, basically. Whereas if there are a lot more loose players in the mix, then you're less likely to open really aggressive, like RFI really aggressively, and you're more likely to bluff catch more aggressively, for example. So it really just depends on who you're playing against, and basically that's, like, when I've been playing lately, my main goal is literally just identifying the player types that I'm playing against. Like, you know, I'll mark regs as just generic reg, so I don't really know how loose or tight they are, and so therefore I don't know how to maximally exploit them if I can. And so it's basically just, you know, whenever they see showdown, look at that hand and see, you know, oh wow, you know, like the one player I noticed yesterday, they RFI'd 4-3 suited on the button versus me, and I'm like, okay, then that makes them more likely to be too loose pre-flop and to, you know, over bluff post flop because of that. And guess what? You know, over the next hour or two, then I noticed them making multiple loose bluffs to where, you know, it's pretty obvious at that point that they're just way over bluffing and they're a loose reg. Whereas somebody who, you know, you've played 5,000 hands against and you've never seen them bluff on the river, then, well, they're probably just a tight reg. And yeah, so identifying the player type that you're playing against is going to be extremely, or the player types that you're playing against is going to be extremely important. And, you know, it doesn't even have to be super difficult or super elaborate. It's just, once you're playing against a tight player, you're just going to overbluff. And so, you know, you might mix in theory, oh, this hand is, you know, 50% bluff, 50% give up, or, you know, whatever. But in practice, if they're just going to way overfold, then you just always bluff it, and you just take mixed hands and you just make them pure. And run them over with aggression. And then against players who aren't going to be run over, then you just play more theoretically sound or whatever if they're a good reg, a loose reg. And, if they're a loose recreational, then if they're going to overbluff, then you just want to check more protected and bluff more, bluff catch more instead of thin value betting, for example. That's another thing. Actually, that's not really that important, but, I guess it's important to check protected because they can find lots of bluffs. So essentially, like against a loose recreational, I'll go super wild with this kind of thing, where I don't know, like for example, say like I open pre and then a loose recreational calls in the big blind or small blind or whatever. If it's an ace high board, I'll just bet all my bluffs, all of my non-showdown, and then I'll just check a ton of top pair, a ton of middling pairs, and king highs and stuff that I can call down with. And if they're gonna over bluff, then you just want to check really protected and just let them bluff. So essentially, just a big part of poker is just play the player. You just want to play the player. You're not just trying to play isolated poker, or like you're not just trying to play in a vacuum. Try to play theoretically well against everybody, or you're not trying to whatever. You don't have to play super balanced necessarily against players who are unbalanced. And so you want to play the player. Identify who you're playing against and maximally exploit them based on that. Go super aggro against tight players. Check protect against loose players who are going to bluff appropriately. Just play theoretically well against loose regs in general. Bluff catch loose recreational super, super aggressively, where it's actually absurd how much they bluff. Or that they just like triple barrel third pair or something, which is essentially a bluff, but they don't really know what they're doing. They're just like, I'll bet, and they're just going to way over bluff. And so you just want to bluff catch them super aggressively. So it just totally depends on who you're playing against, as to how you want to play. In some lineups, maybe you want to, like your VPIP can probably adjust between like 23% and like 30% or something, depending on who you're playing against, or something absurd. And like c-bet frequencies can be anywhere from like, I don't know, you could go anywhere from like 60, 50, 50 for like c-bet flop, c-bet turn, c-bet river, to all the way to like 80, 70, 70 or something like that against certain players. Maybe not that aggressive, but like, I don't know, like 70, 60, 60 or something like that against tight players, because, you just check your middle and showdown value and stuff because, they're going to overfold, so you're not getting the value, and then you just bluff all your non-showdown value and bet all your strong value, and so then you're going to end up just betting super aggressively. So it basically playing against different player types. It just depends on who you're playing against, and when you actually have a good idea of who you're playing against, then you can turn regs into recreationals and gain a decent edge against regs. I mean, you're not going to gain much of an edge against a good reg, obviously, but against the weaker regs, you can gain a pretty decent edge. And you'd be surprised how much they let you run them over and stuff. And you would be surprised how much you can bluff catch against loose recreationals. I can just think in my head like so many times that I've gone for a bluff catch in the last few days against loose recreationals, and they just have a bluff like 10, 15, 20% more often than they really should. So just play the player and you can just gain so much extra EV through doing so. Thanks for watching.